It begins with a silence disguised as prosperity, a time when trade routes hum like arteries and wealth moves faster than conscience. The world believes itself to be advancing, inventing, connecting. But beneath that movement lies a quiet addiction, a system feeding on dependence. In the vast colonial ports of a rising empire, ships drift across oceans heavy with the promise of profit. Their cargo is not invention or progress. It is a seed of decay, disguised as commerce, destined to alter the balance of nations. No one calls it evil, not yet. In the beginning, it feels like opportunity. A merchant family arrives in a city built on foreign rule and unspoken bargains. They come with nothing visible, only knowledge, connections, and timing. They enter a world run by a corporation that behaves like a government, where laws are written by shareholders and justice is measured in dividends. The city itself is young, restless, expanding. Its streets pulse with traders speaking in half a dozen tongues, each chasing the same mirage. Fortune. The merchant sees what others overlook. He understands that power is never moral, it is procedural. It moves according to need, not virtue. And what the empire needs now is a solution to imbalance. It buys from a distant civilization, silk, porcelain, tea, and receives in return nothing but indifference. Its wealth bleeds outward, silver draining like lifeblood into foreign hands. Diplomacy fails. Pride forbids concession. And so an answer emerges, cold and efficient. Reverse the flow. Fields are planted not with sustenance, but with dependency. Poppies stretch across the plains like a red ocean under the colonial sun. Each bloom holds the empire's salvation, each capsule a promise to stabilize its economy through chemical control. The trade is sanctioned, taxed, and celebrated. Officials look the other way, or rather, they look through it, understanding that destruction elsewhere means equilibrium at home. It is policy disguised as commerce, morality hidden behind the veneer of market logic. The merchant does not invent this system. He perfects it. He does not fight the empire. He becomes its instrument. Through precision and calculation, he transforms what was once smuggled into what is now structured. His ships follow the wind with mathematical certainty. His ledgers track human ruin as profit margins. Warehouses rise, fleets expand, and the rhythm of commerce becomes indistinguishable from the rhythm of addiction. Each chest sealed. Each shipment dispatched. Each account reconciled. These are the rituals of a new faith, the faith of perpetual growth. In the city's marketplaces, coins change hands, and gratitude replaces suspicion. Philanthropy begins to bloom as quickly as the poppies that fund it. Libraries, hospitals, schools, each a monument to generosity, each financed by misery unseen. Respectability is the final product. It is sold more effectively than the narcotic itself. Meanwhile, across the sea, another nation collapses inward. Its ports fill with smoke, its people with hunger. Families vanish into the haze of dependency, while their silver, their labor, their strength migrate outward. The emperor calls it equilibrium. The merchant calls it business. History will call it the birth of industrialized addiction. And through it all, the world remains still on the surface. Ships sail, markets open, donations flow. The machinery of exploitation hums softly, too steady to hear. Only much later will anyone notice that something irreversible has begun. The moment when profit first outweighed mercy, when an empire mistook destruction for balance, and when a single family learned that to rule in silence is the surest way to endure. The storm didn't begin with violence. It began with balance, an illusion crafted through precision, policy, and paperwork. The system appeared seamless. Opium moved east, silver returned west, and the ledgers stayed clean. Each year, the numbers grew. From tens of thousands of chests to hundreds of thousands, the trade ballooned until it became indistinguishable from governance itself. Railroads were laid, ports deepened, bureaucracies funded, all underwritten by addiction. But equilibrium cannot survive imbalance forever. The first fractures appeared not in the market, but in the margins. In the quiet spaces between profit and consequence, where human lives, once abstract, began to blur the columns. In the ports of the East, men wasted into shadows, families shrank under the weight of dependency, and the very hands that once picked tea or carved jade now trembled from hunger. Entire cities began to forget their past, and silver, once a measure of wealth, returned as a token of submission. The merchant empire did not waver. It expanded. With each restriction came innovation, with each barrier, a new route. Where others saw resistance, the family saw inefficiency. Logistics became art, and corruption a necessary lubricant. Their reach extended beyond shipping. They financed the cultivation. They insured the cargo. They owned the ships, the docks, the silence. When war finally came, it did not arrive as punishment. It came as preservation. The merchants' allies, those seated in marble offices oceans away, had seen the threat. A sovereign power had seized the product, burned it publicly, and questioned its morality. The challenge was not merely legal, it was existential. If one nation could reject the flow, others might follow. If the trade stopped, the empire's balance sheet would tilt toward collapse. So they answered not with negotiation, but with fire. Ironclads sailed, cities burned, treaties signed under duress. And when the smoke cleared, the ports were open wider than before. Trade was legalized, not just permitted, but protected. A sovereign nation's resistance was rewritten as rebellion. The language of contracts replaced the language of ethics. And the merchants, who had backed the war in quiet corridors and private ledgers, were rewarded with expansion. The family grew with the conquest. Their fleets multiplied, their offices stretched across continents. What had begun in a single colonial port now echoed from Canton to Calcutta. But power has a gravity, and as the family's influence expanded, so did the expectations placed upon them. They could no longer exist in shadows. Their names adorned libraries. Their donations funded orchestras and orphanages. They became emblems of progress, symbols of benevolence. No one spoke of the weight beneath the marble. No one questioned the foundation of their charity. The buildings stood clean, the ledgers cleaner. History was being written in real time, not by those who suffered, but by those who sponsored the ink. And through it all, the system deepened. The addiction they exported became normalized, not through denial, but through scale. When ruin touches millions, it no longer feels like crime. It feels like economics. The family had not merely profited from the drug trade. They had made it structural. They had embedded it in the DNA of modern commerce. Yet somewhere beneath the surface, change was forming, not from morality or law, but from overreach. For a machine running at full speed cannot see its own erosion. And even as the ships grew larger, even as the ports widened, the first echoes of decline were stirring. Not in the balance sheets, not yet. But in the quiet fury of those who had paid the price too long, and in the growing knowledge that no empire feeds forever without consequence. The family remained unaware, or perhaps unbothered. Expansion had become instinct. They did not see that in the pursuit of permanence, they had planted the seeds of their undoing. That in reaching for legacy, they had begun to stretch the system beyond its capacity to bear. And as the ships moved forward, the tide beneath them had already begun to turn. The illusion of permanence is the first luxury of power. When a system grows too large to imagine its own end, it stops evolving. It begins to fight on itself. The merchant dynasty believed it had achieved stability, an empire without borders, a fortune without limit. Their ledgers gleamed with precision. Their hierarchy ran like clockwork. Every transaction was recorded, every route mapped, every risk insured. They mistook organization for immortality. The city that once received them as outsiders now worshipped their success. Statues rose, honors were bestowed, and their name became synonymous with prosperity. Their warehouses towered over harbors that once belonged to others. The rhythm of the docks echoed their will, the hiss of ropes, the clang of crates, the endless churn of commerce. And yet, beneath that rhythm, a subtle distortion grew. Too much wealth in too few hands, too much power in too few ledgers. Systems built on extraction eventually exhaust what they extract. Across the sea, the collapse continued. A civilization that once prided itself on harmony was now fractured by dependency. Generations were consumed, cities hollowed, dignity eroded, but distance concealed consequence. The family saw only profit. The empire saw only balance restored. And so the structure hardened. The addiction became infrastructure, the suffering invisible. Time, however, erodes even the strongest facades. Success invites imitation, and imitation brings competition. New merchants entered the trade, new markets emerged, and the family who once controlled the entire chain began to feel its grasp loosen. The empire that had protected them began to change as well. Bureaucrats replaced conquerors. Profit replaced principle. The machine they had helped build no longer needed them to run. To maintain control, they diversified. They moved into textiles, banking, real estate. They invested in what appeared clean, modern, legitimate. The narcotic was becoming unfashionable, its consequences too visible to ignore. Philanthropy became their shield. Endowments multiplied. Institutions bore their name. They donated hospitals to heal what their fortune had broken, libraries to enlighten those they had kept in shadow. Each gift was a calculated confession, written in marble and silence. But the veneer of charity cannot hide the architecture of exploitation forever. Even the most polished empire depends on obedience, and obedience fades when profit falters. Their networks began to strain. Partners turned rivals. Offspring inherited power, but not the discipline that built it. The wealth that once united them began to divide them. Beneath the chandeliers of their mansions, the same rot that had consumed their markets began to consume their bloodline. And still they believed they were secure. They mistook visibility for virtue. They thought the world had forgotten what they sold, that history had lost its appetite for memory. But systems built on denial eventually reach a point of reckoning. When the people who paid the price finally outnumber those who profited, silence becomes impossible. By the end of the century, the family had achieved everything they desired: titles, respectability, endurance. But beneath that triumph, a quiet imbalance had taken root, moral, economic, and generational. Their fortune depended on the memory of a war that could not be forgotten, on the addiction of a people who would not remain subdued. And though the ledgers still shone, the foundations had begun to crumble. They could not yet see it, but the world they built was already turning against them, one quiet act of erosion at a time. Momentum conceals fragility. As the family's empire surged toward its peak, success cast a long shadow, one that stretched across oceans, obscuring the consequences beneath. They had conquered trade without lifting a weapon, bent empires through commerce, and shaped cities with gold pulled from human dependency. The ports they funded, the railroads they laid, the banks they chartered, these were not ornaments, they were anchors. Their fortune had become infrastructure, and infrastructure is hard to question when the world depends on it. By now, their operations moved like tides. Predictable, powerful, and taken for granted. Contracts renewed themselves, alliances held through inertia. Every churning crate of opium, every shipment of cotton, every bond underwritten by their own capital fed the illusion of infinite expansion. The family had become a mirror of the empire itself, proud, global, unstoppable. Their name carried weight not because of fear, but familiarity. It had become part of the architecture, engraved on libraries, whispered in auctions, etched into city maps. But beneath the grandeur, something subtle shifted. The machinery they built began to rust in places they refused to inspect. The world was changing. The monopoly they had once mastered was no longer singular. Rivals emerged, some foreign, some familial. Sons and nephews inherited control, but not conviction. They were born into comfort, not conquest. They remembered wealth, but not risk. And wealth without risk breeds carelessness. Their markets, once meticulously managed, began to overreach. Too much product flooded too few hands. Local economies warped under the weight of dependency. And where once a single port held sway, now dozens clamored for a share. Margins thinned. Corruption spread from utility to necessity. And in the boardrooms, the same men who once spoke in strategy now spoke in panic. The family responded the only way they knew, by buying more stability. They doubled their investments in institutions, expanded into European finance, and tied their name ever more tightly to charity. Their generosity was now their defense. Who could question the hand that fed the city? Who would accuse the benefactor who built hospitals? But the illusion of immunity is always temporary. In lands they once subdued through trade, resentment hardened. Old wounds deepened, and new regimes born of resistance began to rise, not with cannons, but with ideology. They did not forget. They taught their children of silver stolen, of lives erased, of sovereignty traded for narcotics. And in that memory, the family's name was no longer benevolent. It was imperial. It was extractive. It was foreign. The empire that had protected them began to fracture from within. The age of conquest was ending. The age of competition, regulation, and revolt was beginning, and those who had built their power on sanctioned exploitation were now vulnerable to a world demanding accountability. But decline, like addiction, rarely announces itself with clarity. It begins quietly. A failed investment, a lost partner, a lawsuit filed and then forgotten. Their fortune still stood, but the architecture was hollowing. Their influence remained, but the center was soft. And as global tides shifted, they began to realize that the world they once bent to their will was no longer listening. They had reached the summit, but the view was blurred by distance, and the air had thinned. What remained was not empire, but inertia, a vast aging machine that no longer knew where it was going, only that it must keep moving. And in that movement, blind and relentless, the seeds of collapse took root. The break didn't arrive with thunder. It came like a tide, slow, steady, irreversible. The systems that once sustained the family's reach no longer responded to control. Their networks weakened, their partnerships thinned. The empire they had helped build was evolving. And they were no longer essential to it. The flow of goods continued, but the current no longer bent in their favor. Across the sea, rebellion hardened into regime. A new order, born from memory and fueled by resentment, no longer tolerated foreign control. The names that once opened doors now drew suspicion. The wealth that once inspired deference now provoked questions. And the empire's old agreements, once ironclad, once sacred, began to crumble under the pressure of ideology and nationalism. In the great cities they had once dominated, offices emptied, properties were seized, titles once whispered in reverence vanished from the ledgers. The family had been symbols of modern commerce. Now they were artifacts of colonial decay. One by one their holdings dissolved. One by one the pillars of their legacy collapsed. Back in the country that had knighted them, their name still held weight. But it was a weight that aged. The new generation of financiers no longer looked to their example. The markets had shifted, the industries they once mastered had splintered, and the legacy they built, fueled by addiction, legitimized by charity, no longer protected them from irrelevance. The final blow wasn't scandal, it wasn't trial, it was administration. Government boards quietly declared their businesses unfit. Managers were replaced. Assets were liquidated. The family didn't fall, they faded. No headlines, no reckoning. Just paperwork. But buildings remained. Libraries, docks, hospitals. Their name, carved into stone, survived the business that funded it. Tourists visited. Photographs were taken. Few asked who paid for the construction or what it cost. And perhaps that was the final transaction, their fortune exchanged for memory. The shame buried beneath philanthropy. The history preserved only in fragments. In exile, the last heirs watched the remnants dissolve. They had inherited vast sums, but little influence. They held documents proving ownership of nothing. The markets had moved on. The world had changed its currency, and for the first time in generations, they were no longer needed. Some would rebuild, quietly, elsewhere, under different names. The pattern always adapts. But the dynasty itself, its central identity, its visible ambition, was finished. A century of expansion, erased in a decade, not by rebellion, but by redundancy. And yet the blueprint remained. The empire had fallen, but its model survived. Industrialized addiction, market-protected exploitation, legitimacy purchased through public good. The cycle had not ended, it had simply migrated. The story of the family was no longer one of triumph. It was a case study, a pattern, a warning. And while they disappeared from the stage, their methods endured in the next generation of commerce. No empire vanishes without echo. No system collapses without residue. The family that once mastered the balance between illegality and respectability had been undone by the very silence they once used as armor. What they built was too efficient, too profitable to die with them, and others had been watching. In the aftermath, what remained was not ruin, but reinvention. The structures they built still stood, libraries visited, hospitals staffed, docks humming with new cargo. The names etched in stone had outlived the hands that carved them. To the public, the legacy appeared untouched, but inside the corridors where wealth once moved with precision, there was only vacancy. The family had vanished, not in shame, not in exile, but in dispersion. A fortune scattered across trusts, accounts, foundations, fragmented into safety. Their heirs moved quietly through the world, insulated by abstraction, protected by the complexity of finance. The system had worked. It always did. When one pillar fell, the weight redistributed. The structure endured. And while the dynasty dissolved, its design did not. The playbook they wrote, through silence, scale, and generosity, had become a manual for others. New industries rose on the same logic. The product changed. The geography shifted. But the mechanics remained. Dependency was rebranded. Regulation became strategy. And public health became a market. In a new century, in new offices, pharmaceutical companies studied the same equations. They mapped supply chains. They charted human behavior. They optimized profit across suffering. Opioids replaced opium. Treatment replaced trade. But the outcome was identical. Millions addicted, lives eroded, wealth concentrated. And when the cost became visible, when lawsuits emerged, when families wept on the evening news, the response was familiar. A fine, a settlement, a foundation, a wing named after the donor, and silence. Like the dynasty before them, these companies did not break laws. They shaped them. They did not hide. They advertised. They donated. They were honored. And when the consequences surfaced, they were restructured, not dismantled. Their executives retired wealthy. Their shareholders profited. Their names were scrubbed from museum walls, but never from offshore accounts. The cycle was complete. The modern merchant did not need ships or plantations. They needed data, distribution, and a compliant regulatory body. The rest was the same. Addiction as a revenue. Dependency as product. Generosity as camouflage. and beneath the surface it spread, beyond painkillers, into medications that managed attention, emotion, metabolism. Each pill a promise, each prescription a contract, not for cure, but for continuation. Repeat usage, long-term dependency, lifelong customers. The same system that once turned poppy fields into empire now turned human bodies into markets. Chronic illness became opportunity. Behavioral disorders became verticals, and the patient, once someone to be healed, became someone to be managed, not restored, but retained. And just as before, those who noticed were dismissed. Critics were labeled unscientific. Regulators were placated. The public was soothed. Until the numbers grew too large. Until the crisis could no longer be ignored. And then, only then, did accountability arrive, not to dismantle the system, but to redirect it. The descendants of the old empire watched from afar. They saw the pattern repeat. They recognized the signs, and perhaps they understood that what they built had not failed. It had succeeded beyond imagination. Because the legacy of an empire is not its collapse. It is its replication. And the family, long buried by history, had left behind not just wealth, but a formula, a silent map for those who would come after. A map that others now followed, step for step, profit for profit. Not because they admired the past, but because they understood what the past had proven, that if destruction is profitable enough, it will always be protected until the very last moment. What follows collapse is not justice. It is memory, shaped by those who can afford to rewrite it. The family's name faded from finance, but not from architecture. Their legacy lingered in stone and ceremony, while the damage was absorbed by silence. The world did not hold them accountable. It rarely does. Instead, it moved on, carrying forward the same principles in new clothing. The institutions they once funded remained intact. Their wealth had been transmuted into cultural permanence. Libraries still curated by grateful patrons, hospital wings still bearing their name. And even as scholars uncovered the origins of their fortune, the tone remained cautious. A nod to complexity, a gesture toward nuance, but rarely clarity, rarely condemnation. Their story became a footnote, not a warning. Their crimes, reclassified as context, because to indict them fully would mean questioning everything built atop their money. And those buildings were too useful, too beautiful, too embedded in the public good to abandon. And so the truth was filed away, not erased, but diluted. The next generation of empire builders learned the lesson well. Make your money from dependency. Channel it into prestige. Let time do the rest. Let death close the case. Let legacy soften the verdict. And legacy is patient. Within a few decades, new names had taken the stage. They arrived not from Baghdad or Bombay, but from boardrooms and biotech labs. They spoke the language of research, wore the costume of progress. But the mechanism was familiar. A substance, a promise, a pipeline, a profit. They did not need to smuggle. They were licensed. They did not need to bribe. They lobbied. Their products were approved. Their charts were clean. And when addiction followed, they denied it. When exposure came, they rebranded. When lawsuits surged, they negotiated. And through it all, the money flowed. Museums were named after them. Medical schools accepted their grants. Politicians praised their innovation. And the public, overwhelmed by complexity, numbed by repetition, moved on. Until the headlines grew too loud. Until death counts made silence unethical. Until even the institutions that once praised them began to sever ties. But by then, it was already over. The wealth was dispersed. The structure survived. Because systems that extract from suffering rarely collapse. They adapt. The product changes, the method evolves, but the core remains. Create need, supply the answer, control the narrative, convert the profits into permanence. And for every lawsuit, a new initiative. For every scandal, a donation. For every overdose, a scholarship. For every destroyed life, a plaque in a university hallway, not as apology, but as insurance. This is not conspiracy. It is history. Repeating through habit, not design. Because once a model proves profitable, it becomes doctrine. Taught in business schools. Codified in policy. Defended as progress. And the architects of the past, the merchants whose names few now remember, watch from beneath stone memorials. They are no longer feared. They are no longer questioned. They are studied, admired, even pitied, as if time had transformed them from perpetrators into participants, as if their choices were inevitable. But they were not. They were calculated, and they were copied. Because in a world that confuses success with virtue, the line between legacy and indictment is paper thin. And those who master that balance write the next chapter, not with justice, but with investment. In the end, only the pattern remains. Names fade, fortunes dissolve. But the architecture of exploitation endures, passed hand to hand like a set of instructions, not through bloodlines, but through systems, through laws shaped in silence, through industries built on repetition. A dynasty ends and another begins. The faces change. The language evolves. But the design does not. The family that once transformed narcotics into respectability lies buried beneath their own monuments. The stones are smooth, the inscriptions grand, the history edited. They were honored for what they gave, not questioned for how they earned it. And that is how empire survives its own collapse, not by vanishing, but by becoming invisible. The cities they shaped moved on. The ports welcomed new cargo. The libraries welcomed new readers. The sickness they sold was rebranded as someone else's crisis. And in the vacuum left by their absence, a new order took hold, driven by the same engine. Dependency as profit, philanthropy as shield, and silence as strategy. No justice arrived, no reckoning balanced the scales. The damage became background. The story was archived. And those who inherited the present learned not from the cost, but from the method. Modern hands now hold the same tools. They do not smuggle, they prescribe. They do not corrupt, they comply. Their supply chains are digital, their influence algorithmic, their language clinical, not colonial. But the result is unchanged, lives managed, not healed, conditions prolonged, not cured. And the cycle begins again. A new family, a new product, a new age. But beneath the progress lies the same gravitational pull toward markets that reward suffering, toward models that scale addiction, toward institutions that accept funding without question. And when the next collapse comes, it will not be sudden. It will arrive quietly, like erosion, through statistics, through whispered resignations, through settlements made in rooms the public will never see. And once again the public will be asked to forget. But memory resists silence. Somewhere the pattern will be recognized. The equation will be named. The cost will be counted, not just in money, but in lives. And the truth will settle like dust across the legacy. History does not punish. It remembers. Not always through outrage, but through repetition. And in that repetition lies the only warning the future receives. That every empire built on human suffering will fall, not because it is immoral, but because it is unsustainable. The hunger it creates cannot be fed forever. The silence it requires cannot be maintained forever. The victims it creates cannot be ignored forever. And when it ends, what's left is not justice, but architecture, buildings bearing names that no longer match the history beneath them, streets that forget who paid for their pavement, foundations built on bones now holding up cathedrals. This is the legacy of the forgotten dynasty, the ones who industrialized addiction, laundered misery into marble, and disappeared before the reckoning arrived. They were not punished, they were studied, and they left behind a formula.